I came back from town humming to myself, expecting the usual calm of my farm, the gentle rustling of the breeze through the fields, the distant mooing of my cattle, and the familiar scent of fresh soil. But the moment I pulled into my driveway, my heart rate spiked like a missile. My front pasture, my personal land, had been turned into what could only be described as an elite suburban circus. Canopies, lawn chairs, picnic blankets. There were at least 40 people relaxing, sipping cocktails, nibbling on cheese boards and laughing as if they had purchased admission to my property. Kids were running through my vegetable garden, trampling the rows I had painstakingly nurtured for weeks. And there, standing in the center of it all, managing traffic, like she ruled the place, was Diane Whitmore. I threw my truck into park so hard the tires slid on the dirt. My farm dog, Duke, jumped from the passenger seat, barking as he sensed my anger. I slammed the door shut, my boots striking the ground with purpose. People barely noticed me at first, too busy clinking their glasses and flipping their gourmet burgers on portable stoves. But when I strode up to Diane, my fists clenched at my sides, she turned to face me with a self-satisfied little smile, the kind that made my fingers itch to grab the nearest garden hose and spray her straight into next year. "Oh, Jake," she said, pretending surprise, as if she hadn't planned this entire mess. "You're back early. We were just enjoying this gorgeous weather. On your lovely land." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the sheer boldness it must take to set up an entire hoa picnic on someone else's private farm without so much as a polite call. "What in the world?" I said, slowly forcing down the rising rage in my throat. "Do you think you're doing on my property?" Diane chuckled, waving a well-manicured hand. "Oh, don't be so overdramatic. We're just having a little neighborhood get-together." The association needed a fresh, scenic place to connect. "And frankly, your farm is much more charming than the community park." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "You mean the community park that you personally had a hand in closing down because you wanted to build a decorative lake instead?" She blinked at me, unfazed. "Details, details. The point is, we needed a spot, and your farm is just sitting here with all this open space. Unused space." I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth throbbed. "Diane, do you understand the concept of private property? You can't just march in here with your wine club and throw a damn gathering in my yard." She sighed, exasperated, as if I were a stubborn child throwing a tantrum over something insignificant. "Oh, Jake, stop being so possessive. You've got all these acres and nothing to do with them. Honestly, it's selfish of you not to share. Think of this as an opportunity for some good relations with the community." I glanced around at the scene. There was an elderly woman setting up a badminton net between two of my fence posts. A group of dads was tossing a football dangerously close to my henhouse. Two kids were chasing my barn cat, and some man in cargo pants was examining my tractor like he was about to put it up for sale. I took a deep breath, my pulse pounding. "I'm going to give you exactly 5 minutes to clear out." Diane rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. We'll be done in a few hours. Just go inside, take a nap or something. You'll barely notice we're here." I smiled then, a slow, knowing smile that made Diane's assurance falter for the first time since I had arrived. "All right," I said, nodding. "If you won't leave willingly, I'll handle it my way." Without another word, I turned on my back and strode toward the barn. My bulls had been locked up all day, anxious, eager for some open space to move their legs. I had been planning on letting them out into the south pasture later in the day, but plans shifted. I reached the heavy wooden gate and unlatched it with a gratifying click. The bulls snorted, sensing their liberty, their massive hooves pounding against the dirt. These weren't your friendly, tame dairy cows. These were bulls, all strength, horns, and dominance, and they weren't used to unexpected guests in their territory. Behind me, I heard Diane still prattling on about how I needed to adopt this spirit of hospitality. That was when I swung the gate wide open. A beat of silence then, with a rumbling sound like distant thunder, the bulls surged forward. Screams erupted across the picnic lawn. Chairs toppled, wine glasses shattered. Someone knocked over an entire folding table as they scrambled to escape. A Man leaped headfirst into a small pool meant for the toddlers. Diane shrieked, her designer sun cap flying off as she tried to run in her high heels. She didn't get far. Her foot got caught in a fallen picnic blanket, sending her sprawling face first into the ground. My bulls, uninterested in actual violence, merely stomped through the chaos, tossing their heads, snorting, and generally ensuring that nobody had the opportunity to feel too comfortable intruding on my land ever again. A man who had previously been grilling steak was now attempting to climb my fence with nothing but a pair of tongs in his hand. Another woman had thrown herself into a bush, where she remained shaking, watching the bulls as though they were fire-breathing beasts, and standing in the middle of it all, now covered in mud, her sundress torn at the edge, was Diane. Her face was red with rage, her eyes locked onto me like she was preparing to personally draft 100 lawsuits. "This isn't over, Jake," she screeched, shaking a fist, as if she were some kind of animated villain. "You think you can scare me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." I leaned against the fence, calm as ever, tipping my hat back as I surveyed the destruction. "Well, Diane," I muttered, "I reckon now you'll think twice before planning any more surprise gatherings on my farm." And with that, I whistled for Duke, turned on my heel, and walked back toward the house, leaving Diane and her Hoa circus to figure out how to escape their very unexpected bull run. Diane was still fuming by the time the last of her picnic crew staggered off my farm. Some of them had lost shoes in the mud, others had wine-stained shirts from panicked collisions, and one particularly unlucky man had a streak of barbecue sauce down his leg, courtesy of an upturned grill. The bulls, now satisfied with their brief chaos, had retreated to their usual grazing spots, their tails flicking lazily as if they hadn't just caused a suburban evacuation. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, watching Diane struggle to compose herself. Her once pristine sundress was smeared with dirt, and a single piece of lettuce clung to her hair like a badge of disgrace. Her nostrils flared as she whipped out her mobile, stabbing at the screen with a fury. "You'll regret this, Jake," she seethed, not even looking up. "I swear on everything, you will pay for this." I shrugged. "Only thing I regret is not grabbing a beer to enjoy the spectacle." She shot me a glare so sharp, I thought it might pierce through my skull. Then with a dramatic huff, she turned on her heel and stomped toward her car, muttering under her breath the whole way. The rest of the Hoa members scurried after her, eager to escape the nightmare I had just unleashed upon them. I figured that was the end of it. I figured wrong. 2 days later, I woke up to the sound of Duke barking his head off. I threw on my boots and stepped out onto the porch, only to find a police cruiser parked in my driveway. A stout officer stood beside it, arms folded, expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Morning, Jake," he said, nodding at me. "Morning, Sheriff," I replied, stepping down the porch steps. "Something I can help you with?" He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Got a complaint filed against you. Reckless endangerment, property damage, public nuisance." I blinked at him. "Public nuisance? I live on a damn farm." He gave me a pointed look. "You released a herd of bulls on a group of people." I smirked. "A group of people who were trespassing on my land." He sighed. "Look, Jake, I know how Diane is, and trust me, between you and me, I wouldn't trust her to lead a fundraiser, let alone in Hoa. But she's pressing hard on this. Got her lawyer friend filing documents, making it sound like you nearly started a stampede straight through town." I crossed my arms, the amusement draining from my face. "So, what? She wants me arrested?" "Not quite, but she sure as hell wants to drag you into court over it." I let out a slow breath, staring past the sheriff toward the open fields beyond. I should have known Diane wouldn't take the defeat quietly. The woman was like a bad rash. Just when you thought you'd gotten rid of her, she flared up worse than before. "All right," I said, cracking my knuckles. "She wants a battle? She's got one." 2 days later, I found myself in the middle of a town meeting. It was held in the old community center, a place that hadn't seen this much drama since the Great Bake-Off controversy of '09, when Mrs. Abernathy accused Mr. Turner of using store-bought pie crust. The room was packed with locals, half of them farmers who had known me since I was young, and the other half were HOA members who looked at me like I was some kind of unhinged criminal. Diane sat near the front, a smug smile fixed across her face. She had cleaned up since her mud-covered humiliation, but there was still an air of tension in her posture, like she was holding onto her grudge with both hands. Next to her sat Todd, a slick-haired attorney who looked like he charged by the minute. The mayor, an older man who had been in office so long that nobody remembered voting for him, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "All right, folks, let's get to it. Seems we've got ourselves a bit of a situation between Jake and the HOA." Diane shot to her feet. "A situation? This is a disgrace. A crime." She turned to the crowd, eyes wide with self-righteous indignation. "This man released wild, dangerous animals on innocent citizens. My friends could have been seriously harmed or worse." I snorted loud enough for the room to hear. "Wild animals, lady? They're bulls, not wolves." Diane ignored me, whipping out a stack of papers. "I have here witness statements, video footage, and a formal legal complaint. This behavior was reckless, unprovoked." Unprovoked, I cut in, stepping forward. "You invaded my land without permission, brought 40 people with you, wrecked my property, and then had the nerve to act like I was the problem." The farmers in the room muttered in agreement, a few nodding along. The HOA folks, however, whispered amongst themselves like I was some kind of menace to society. Todd, the lawyer, stood up, then, buttoning his suit jacket, like he was about to deliver the case of the century. "Mr. Simmons," he said smoothly, "do you deny that you deliberately released aggressive livestock in response to this gathering?" I tilted my head. "Do you deny that your client was trespassing?" Todd gave a forced smile. "My client was under the belief that this land was community space." I chuckled. "Community space? You mean my land? The land I pay taxes on? The land I own?" Diane huffed. "It was an honest mistake." I leveled a glare at her. "Funny how? Your honest mistake involved setting up grills, tents, and decorations like you planned the whole thing days in advance." The room fell silent. Even some of the HOA members looked at her suspiciously now. The mayor sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right. Here's what I see, Diane. You and your HOA folks were in the wrong for using Jake's land without authorization. Jake, you probably shouldn't have let loose a bunch of bulls in response. But honestly, can't say I wouldn't have done the same." A few chuckles rippled through the room. The mayor turned to Diane. "Drop the charges, Diane. You know damn well you don't have a case, and if you try to push it, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of person you are." Diane stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she might actually explode, but instead, she let out a sharp breath and gave a reluctant nod. "Fine, but this isn't over." I smirked. "It never is with you, is it?" With a dramatic flourish, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, her HOA followers trailing behind. I turned to the mayor. "Guess that's settled, then," he chuckled. "For now, but I'd keep an eye on her. That woman holds grudges like a damn snapping turtle." I shook his hand and left the meeting with a satisfied grin. Diane thought she had won the battle. She had no idea the war had just begun. Diane didn't take the loss quietly. That much was obvious when I woke up the next morning to find a stack of official-looking papers stuffed into my mailbox. I pulled them out, flipping through the pages with a scowl. Property dispute. She was actually trying to claim that a section of my land wasn't legally mine, that some old zoning rule made it community property. I let out a slow breath, resisting the urge to crumple the papers into a ball and feed them to my bulls instead. I grabbed my truck keys and drove straight to the county records office. If Diane wanted to play legal games, I'd play back. The clerk behind the desk was an old friend, Mrs. Barlow, who had been working there since before I was born. She peered over her glasses when I handed her the documents, her lips pressing into a thin line as she skimmed them. "Oh, she's desperate," she muttered, flipping through the records on her desk. "I remember this land being properly deeded to your family, clear as day. Think she's got anything to stand on?" I asked, leaning against the counter. Mrs. Barlow scoffed. "Not unless she's found a time-traveling machine and gone back 70 years to change the files." She pulled out an old worn folder and set it in front of me. Your grandfather won this land fair and square in a lawful property transfer. The only thing Diane has is wishful thinking. I grinned. Perfect. That should have been the end of it. But Diane wasn't the type to go down without a fight. She had money, influence, and just enough legal know-how to be a pain in my neck. A week later, got served with an official lawsuit. She wasn't just claiming part of my land. She was trying to sue for damages, claiming my bulls had caused emotional distress and endangered public safety. The amount she was asking for was ridiculous, but that wasn't the goal. She didn't care about the money. She just wanted to make my life miserable. I wasn't about to let her win. I hired my own lawyer, an old cowboy named Ed, who had been handling cases like this longer than Diane had been alive. He was the type of guy who showed up to court in a boatee and cowboy boots, unimpressed by fancy legal jargon. When we sat down to go over the case, he just chuckled. She's grasping at straws, he said, flipping through the lawsuit papers. She's hoping you'll settle just to make her go away. She doesn't know me very well, does she? I said, cracking my knuckles. Ed smirked. No, but she's about to learn. The court date was set, and the whole town was buzzing about it. Folks took sides, half of them rooting for me, the other half whispering about how Diane was just trying to improve the area. It was absurd. The woman moved to a farm town and then got mad that she lived next to a farm. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was crowded. Diane showed up looking smug, wearing a sharp business suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Her lawyer, Todd, was by her side, shuffling documents, like he had something important to say. Ed leaned over to me and whispered, "You ready for some fun?" I grinned. Always. The judge, an older man who had probably heard every ridiculous case under the sun, sighed as he looked at the papers in front of him. All right. Let's get to it, Ms. Whitmore. You're claiming damages against Mr. Simmons due to an incident on his property. Diane stood up, smoothing down her blazer. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Simmons released aggressive livestock on a group of unsuspecting residents, creating a dangerous situation that could have resulted in serious injury. The judge turned to me. Mr. Simmons, is this accurate? I stood, tipping my hat slightly. Your Honor, my land was trespassed on by Miss Whitmore and her guests without my permission? I took reasonable action to reclaim my property. Todd scoffed. Reasonable? You set bulls loose on a group of civilians. Ed leaned forward. Your Honor, may I submit evidence? The judge nodded, and Ed pulled out a large envelope, sliding it across the table. The judge opened it and pulled out a series of photos clear as day, showing Diane and her group setting up their picnic, hauling in grills, setting up tables. One particularly damning picture showed Diane smiling proudly as she held up a bottle of wine, posing next to a handmade banner that read Hoa Spring Gathering. The judge frowned. Miss Whitmore, this doesn't look like an accident, it looks like a planned event. Diane shifted uncomfortably. It was a misunderstanding. Ed smirked. Your Honor, we also have signed statements from multiple witnesses, neighbors who were invited to this event, confirming that Miss Whitmore knowingly set up this gathering on Mr. Simmons' land without permission. The judge looked unimpressed. Ms. Whitmore, you trespassed on private property. You do not have a legal right to be there. And as for the aggressive livestock, he sighed, rubbing his temples. It's a farm. Livestock exists on farms. Todd scrambled to retrieve the case. Your Honor, my client was unaware that the land was restricted property. The judge cut him off. Are you seriously telling me that your client didn't know that the fenced farm with barns, fields, and animals wasn't private property? Todd paused, then sat down. The judge shook his head. Case closed. And Miss Whitmore, I'd recommend you learn the difference between community areas and personal property before wasting the court's time again. The hammer came down. And just like that, it was finished. Diane turned scarlet, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she grabbed her bag and marched out, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. I stepped outside, breathing the fresh air. The locals who had gathered outside clapped me on the shoulder, laughing and cheering. She really believed she was going to win that one. Ed chuckled, adjusting his cap. She'll be back, I said, flexing people like her never change. And I was correct. Diane didn't quit, but she never tried to steal my land again. Instead, she settled for hostile notes, unnecessary HOA rules, and the occasional complaint to the town council about the odor of my farm animals. In response, I made sure to build my new henhouse as close to the HOA boundary as possible. I figured if Diane wanted to reside near a farm, she ought to get the full experience.